Hello and welcome back. We now look at the final substantive topic in the second topic of the main syllabus, which is local self-government. Now, the syllabus very specifically talks about talks about the issues of devolution, and also talks about the devolution of power and finances. Now, the thing is, the questions have been about power and about finances, about functions and about finances, and also a larger review of local self-government. And because we're looking at 25 years of the Panchayat Extension Scheduled Areas Act, I do suspect a question on this, and this should also be prepared from an essay point of view, because you could use this in participative governance, you could use this in strengthening grassroots democracy, and several other areas where this becomes sort of important. The historical context that you could use in your essays and in a very brief manner in your GS answers, if they are for 200 marks or so, or for 12 and a half, 200 words or so, or 12 and a half marks or so, is that originally in the Rig Vedic period around the 1200 BC, there were sabhas which were essentially responsible for the administration of the area, and these sabhas gradually were converted into panchayats, and they were sort of headed by 5 people. In the exam, even if you just mentioned that the Rig Vedic period did have the concept of a local democratic entity, that is actually more than enough. In the medieval period, there was a sense of deterioration of this setup of administration, this setup of government, this setup of representation, because there was an increase in the landlord or the zamindari system in the rural areas, wherein power was concentrated with people who were also owning land, and land has always been a very, very important entity of the ethos of the Indian system. Now, of course, India has seen multiplicity of dynasties across history, and that's how the concept of Kotwal came. And of course, the word Kotwal today is an important and a very tangible and a very relatable ingredient of the administrative ecosystem, wherein the Mughal era sort of came up with the word Kotwal, whose job was to essentially, administer the area, collect local tax, and other sort of incidental functions. Now, sorry, in the British era, of course, they were not too much in favor of any form of decentralization, especially after the revolt of 1857, and the Government of India Act therefore removed any form of decentralization provisions that existed. Further, this was accentuated by the Montague-Chelmsford reforms of 1919 after the World War I, where England was, of course, at the back foot, was not in a strong position globally, and that is where things were slightly difficult. And at that time, to sort of balance it out, there was some autonomy given to provincial government, and these provincial government were also curating the idea of elected representatives. Later on, through the Government of India Act 1935, and of course in the middle there were 2 separate lists, one for the governor and one for the local representatives, and the powers are of course very, very limited and were almost notional in nature, but the fact that they existed was an encouraging sign. But the Government of India Act 1935, they were sort of taken away, and we had, I think, the reserved list and the transferred list in the Government of India Act 1935, and it was not a very pro-decentralization law, and this is essentially what happened before independence. But after independence, of course, the first thing that we must always know is that directive principles of state policy very categorically mention strengthening Panchayati Raj. Very specifically, it does not particularly mention urban local self-government, but Panchayati Raj in general in part 4. And then, of course, the government has set up several committees, such as the Balwant Rai Committee, the Santhanam Committee, the Ashok Mehta Committee, the GVK Rao Committee, and the LM Singhvi Committee. We know that all of these committees have successfully recommended, say, a 1-layer, a 2-layer, a 3-layer, a district level committee, and how there should be a constitutional amendment in the first place. See, the principle of local self-government is democratic decentralization, whereas the dream of the idea of local self-government is devolution, because devolution requires the transfer of legislative power to to the local self-government, and that becomes legally very complex, because local self-government, as I've mentioned before, is in the state list. So while you can create institutions that foster and give structure to local self-government, the actual powers to the representatives of the local self-government would still be dependent on the will of the states. In the exam, I don't see a question on the historical basis of the local self-government. If it's a 20 marker, you could probably make a small table out of it and write one line for each committee, or in the essay you could sort of talk about it, and that's pretty much it. Just to sort of quickly run through the basic features. 73rd Amendment talks about the rural local self-government, and 74th Amendment talks about the urban self-government, and these are complemented with the 11th and the 12th schedule, which is essentially a list of subjects that we expect the states to devolve at a given point of time. The fundamental difference is that rural self-government is 3-tier, and urban self-government is 2-tier. The minimum age for voting is 18, and the minimum age to contest an election is 21. There's a minimum 1/3 reservation for seats reserved for women at all levels. However, very recently Haryana has increased the reservation for women up to 50%, and not only Haryana but 19 other states have also done so. So there is a larger movement in the states of the country where we're looking at more reservation for women in rural local bodies. I will attach a note with this to specifically address it, but this is largely used as context because there has been a dedicated question with respect to education in the previous year, in 2015 or 16. Of course, apart from that, there is reservation which is introduced for SC and ST category of persons, and you of course have two bodies, the State Election Commission and the State Finance Commission. Apart from this, you also have certain voluntary provisions such as reservations for backward classes and so on and so forth. At the most, you could take a note of it and refer to your standard books for this. The idea is the questions in the mains exam are not about these basic features. They're not about writing theoretical answers on it, but analytical answers on how effective this is and how effective can this be as an instrument of governance. This is the larger structure for those of you who need some conceptual clarity in terms of how the legislature and the executive at the lower level sort of works. And if you've done your basics, you'll be able to sort of understand this. You can pause this video for about a minute or two and sort of go through this and understand exactly what we're talking about. The fundamental difference here is that at least in the urban setup, when we look at the district level, the composition of the body at the district level depends on the size, whereas that's not the case in the rural part of the country. Apart from that, of course, you have your legislatures and you have your executives, and of course you have your elected and your permanent executives. The idea here is it is compulsory to have a directly elected Gram Sabha, which means everybody who's above the age of 18 in our country happens to automatically be a member of the Gram Sabha of the village that they come from, which is why the Gram Sabha becomes one of the only functional tools of what is called direct democracy in India. And you could quote this, and you can quote me on this in your answers. This is factually correct. So you could go through this table to get a better understanding of it. I will not waste your time covering through basics here. But now let's come to the mains part of it. You see, whenever you're looking at reviewing panchayati raj institutions, this essentially happens on 7 basic parameters. Now, the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, which is the nodal ministry for it, in addition to the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, which also sort of looks at certain decentralization or specialized provisions, but it is the Ministry of Panchayati Raj which is the nodal agency for promoting local self-government in the country. They commission a study called Devolution Index. Devolution Index is basically ranking states on how efficient they are, on how panchayat friendly they are, and the general thumb rule is that the southern states do better than the northern states, which is also the case here. So you could actually go out on a whim and write Kerala is among the top states and say Bihar or UP is among the bottom rung states here, and you would be still factually correct. Now, the devolution index is based on 3 themes, and these 3 themes have actually been asked in the exams as these 3 themes. These 3 themes are functions, functionaries, and finance. So there have actually been 2 questions on this. First is an overall review of this as an instrument of governance, and how panchayats are now no longer just about functions, functionaries and finance, but also are they truly functional in terms of their relevance, in terms of their utility. So to understand this better, let's look at it in a deeper manner. So these basic 3 themes can actually be your answer structure for any question on Panchayati Raj, on functions, functionaries, finance and functionality. At the same time, you could also look at sub-points under these themes, such as, for example, understanding the conduct of panchayat elections. Second, the devolution of financial powers. Third, the devolution of functions and functionaries. Fourth, the constitution of district planning committees, which by the way is under the 74th Constitution Amendment, not the 73rd Amendment. It's a common mistake that a lot of students make while they write their answers on how relevant and how functional is the Gram Sabha, the Panchayat Extension Schedule Act of 1996 and its relevance. And this I do foresee to be relatively important, and checks and balances over Panchayati Raj and accountability. So these are the 7 major issues that sort of are the sub points under functions, functionaries and finance. So if I call functions as F1, functionaries as F2, finance as F3 and functionality as F4, I can redistribute these 7 points on F1, F2, F3 and F4. For example, the conduct of panchayat elections is essentially F2. The devolution of financial powers is actually F3. Devolution of functions and finance functionaries is F1 and F2. Constitution of district planning committees is F2. Status of the Gram Sabha is F1. PISA of 1996 is F1, and checks and balances over PRS and accountability is actually F4. And this is largely how you could reorganize them and write it accordingly. And I have a few points that I think we could write in answers here. Now you have to be a little more logical and rational here. Would you get a dedicated question just on conduct of panchayat elections? No. Devolution of financial powers, yes. Innovative ways to give more finance, yes. There has been a previous year question on this. Devolution on function and functionaries, yes. Independent question, yes. Independent question, yes. Constitution of district planning committees, you could get a half question on this but not a dedicated full question on this. Status of Gram Sabha, yes. PISA, yes. Checks and balances, yes. Which means you have to prepare these questions accordingly. You need to have more points for the ones that have put a tick on. You need to have lesser points for the points that have put a cross on, and that will help you prepare your answers better. So let's understand this in a larger context. So when we talk about devolution of financial powers to Panchayati Raj institutions, so where is the issue? See, the recommendations of the state finance commissions, which are to be set up to recommend the state governments on how much money should actually be given to Panchayati Raj institutions, is essentially based on 3 categories. First is the assignment of taxes, duties and levies that are given to local bodies. Second is the sharing of revenue proceedings, and third is the amount of grants that the state government could give. What the Finance Commission of India is to the center and the states is what the State Finance Commission is to states and local self-government. Now, how does this work? The analysis here is many of the state governments have actually agreed to give Panchayati Raj institutions a specific fixed percentage in some of the state taxes, like land revenue and certain cess on it, some additional stamp duty, entertainment tax, royalties on minerals and mines, forest revenue, market fees. Now, these taxes are less buoyant in nature in the sense that they are not particularly very heavy and also have no relation to the powers and functions to be devolved, which means just because you get a share in these taxes doesn't necessarily mean that you get the power to impose these taxes and charges. This is something that has been handed over to you by the government on their discretion. And almost all state finance commissions have always put great emphasis on internal revenue mobilization, but none of them have actually given an effective mechanism on how they could generate their own revenue. Everybody says Panchayati Raj and Panchayat institutions should be self-sufficient, but how do they become self-sufficient is the larger question. Now, the state finance commissions do suggest that your existing tax jurisdictions, for example, how property taxation happens, you usually end up looking at a district level collection of property taxes or stamp duty. While the collection of stamp duty at the district level is not a very prominent source of income for the districts, but at the same time, it is something which does give a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. Now, the issue here particularly is that you could involve the Panchayati Raj institutions here to play a greater role in the collection of stamp duty and obviously get a percentage of it and therefore use it to become financially sustainable, and that can always help. Furthermore, till the time they're actually financially dependent on funds from the state government, the state budget should also the state budgets should clearly identify that if you have your district sector plans, then these plans should also have Panchayati Raj as a component, and at any given point of time, 30 to 40% of a state's plan should be devolved on local bodies, and a leading example of this is the state of Kerala. Apart from this, you should also have certain untied funds, which basically means that, for example, there would be an X amount of money which would be allocated to midday meal, a Y amount of money which could be allocated for minority education. There should be a Z amount of money which should be left to the discretion of the Panchayati Raj institutions on how they want to spend that money, and could also use it more innovatively and look at investment in or spending money in newer initiatives. At the same time, if you can have state training for administrators, you can have central training for administrators, you can have MP and MLA training programs, you should also have training programs for PRI functionaries, because unless they are not skill equipped, if they are not administratively equipped, if they are not equipped to handle the processes of money transfers, it of course becomes slightly difficult and it becomes incredibly problematic. Then we look at the devolution of functions and functionaries. Right now, when you look at Madhya Pradesh and Kerala, wherein they have sort of taken the lead in, especially if in case of devolution of subjects. So Madhya Pradesh might not be very effective in the way local self-government works, but they've definitely tried their level best in devolving a higher number of subjects. And the idea is, if you take just the example of local self-government in the rural ecosystem, there are about 29 subjects in the 11th schedule. It is very important for state governments to say, if for example sanitation is something that you would want to give to local self-government. Now, it's not one local self-government. There is a Gram Sabha, there is a Panchayat Samiti, there is a Zilla Parishad. Now, exactly what about sanitation will be done by the Gram Sabha, done by the Panchayat Samiti, done by the Zilla Parishad? This must also be clearly defined and sort of executed by the state government. It's also very important to note that absolutely no state in this country has transferred all 29 subjects, because everybody is playing conservative, largely because the second you give more powers to your local self-government, it's the powers are actually lost by the states, because you would obviously be giving more development, more welfare, more grassroots related subjects to local self-government. You would not be giving stuff like atomic energy to local self-government, which anyways is not in the 11th schedule. So at some point of time, the collateral damage is going to be the states. Whether the center then directly starts sending money to Panchayati Raj institutions, or that makes the bureaucracy also sort of nothing more than a middleman, middle person, so to speak. And at the same time, it also sort of makes the state governments crave for attention in not necessarily a good way. So that of course is a larger problem. So in short, there has to be a change, and this has to sort of be done. So when we look at it from a formative phase, we have to look at essentially giving more powers. Now from the formative phase to the phase of functionality, you see, where is the problem? The problem here is when you look at encroachments in their functioning by various other bodies such as water development boards, smart city special purpose vehicles, or PWD and so on and so forth. What you're essentially doing is you are taking away what the local self-governments have been wanting to do. They want to build their own roads, they want to build their own rural infrastructure, and they want to decide how they want to use water which is available for them. At the same time, when you have administrative appointments such as commissioners in municipal bodies or gram sevaks, they of course come with a chip on their shoulder and they come with designated powers. And third, of course, is the fact that they do not have the infrastructure, the knowledge and the skills to deal with, say, demographic issues, education issues, suburban sprawling issues, climate changing issues, and that is where the functionality becomes a larger question mark, and that needs to be solved at all given points of time. And where rural and urban meet is actually through district planning committees or DPCs. You see, there are many states who still not constituted it. In fact, if you look at there's about 9 states such as Haryana, that also in just 3 districts, Karnataka in 10 out of 27 districts, Kerala, MP, Rajasthan, Sikkim, Tamil Nadu, Tripura, West Bengal, and 2 union territories such as Andaman and Daman and Diu have actually taken proactive actions to implement or to constitute district planning commissions. In fact, in Kerala, the district planning committees, in fact in Kerala, you've also created something called a VTC, a voluntary technical corps, which is essentially about 10,000 technically experienced people to vet and rework the projects. And this essentially is an incentivized program. So people are more involved in the community, people are more participative in the community, and therefore helping the community get better. We then have to then understand in a larger discussion on the status of the Gram Sabha. You see, it is a very clear observation that most states have not spelt the exact powers of the Gram Sabha, and nor have you given any sort of parliamentary procedures or certain standard operating procedures on how they work. Like for example, in most states there is a law that says that the Gram Sabha should meet at least 2 times a year. What happens is mostly they meet 2 times at the most in a year. The minimum has been looked at from a maximum point of view. Secondly, the provision of doing away with the need of quorum for adjourned meetings has been reinforced. The tendency to look at Gram Sabha meetings as a mere formality. That a quorum is, say, you need about 10% of the people to be present in the Lok Sabha or the assemblies or anywhere in a legislative house for it to function. Now, in some states, you don't need quorum for a Gram Sabha to meet, which means the whole idea of the Gram Sabha becomes redundant in the first place. And third, states also look at very ritualistic functions. Ritualistic functions in the sense that the Gram Sabhas are supposed to perform local customs and ceremonial sort of arrangements and not really core functions of development. The idea here is that we are also looking at concepts of social audit, and social audits and local sort of mechanisms such as environmental impact assessments. Those things cannot happen without a functional and a prosperous Gram Sabha. See, they're supposed to recommend and consider annual accounts, administrative audits. All of these things should be taken into consideration. The Gram Sabha is like the Lok Sabha of the village, and the Gram Panchayat is like the Council of Ministers for a village. Now, the Council of Ministers should not take the Lok Sabha for granted, right? Like it happens at the center, it should not also happen at the local level. Now, the idea is this should be, restricted to a village or a maximum of 2 to 3 villages, where you must understand that at the end of the day, it's a quantity-quality debate. When the Gram Sabhas are when you have one Gram Sabha for 2 or 3 very, very small villages, then the meeting must happen village-wise. And they firstly not happen enough, and 2, they don't really get into the depth of the issues as such, and this is the problem. Okay, now we should also look at the Panchayat Extension Scheduled Areas Act, which is very, very important. This came into force in 1996. This extends to the tribal areas of 8 states such as Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Gujarat, Himachal, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa and Rajasthan. It does not extend to 7 schedule areas, which is where the controversy has been with the amendment bill that we're talking about. Now, the idea here is that you want to give tribal society to control its own destiny, to control its own resources. It gives extraordinary governance powers to the local community, gives them a sense of belonging, gives them a sense of ownership. And what used to happen was, before this law, laws which were made by the central and the state governments were directly applicable to tribal areas who were indigenously dependent on the ecosystem that they thrive on, that they are dependent on for sustenance and everything. And in fact, this becomes the very first law for empowering people to define and redefine their administrative boundaries. It basically says that the tribal Gram Sabha should be so defined to sort of empower developmental plans, control all functionaries, minor water bodies, ownership of minor minerals and non-timber forest resources. Because we're looking at 25 years of this, therefore it becomes sort of important. Let's understand this. When we look at the Panchayat Extension of Scheduled Areas Act of 1996, what is it that we are largely talking about? It's a law which has been enacted by the Government of India to cover those areas which are not under the 73rd Amendment. It essentially is having very simple objectives: to extend provisions of Part 9, which was inserted through the 73rd Amendment, to scheduled areas with certain additional powers, largely based on the principle of participative democracy amongst tribal populations, and to ensure that there is true power at the local level and not sort of allow higher panchayats or higher forms of local bodies to overpower. Now, there are certain key important features of this. They are, for example, 1. Every Gram Sabha shall be competent to safeguard and preserve the traditions and customs, their cultural identity. It empowers the Gram Sabhas to play a very, very important role in development plans, land acquisition, agri markets, certain minor consumption practices, minor forest produce, and so on and so forth. The Supreme Court, in a landmark case in 2013, actually had asked the Odisha government to go to the Gram Sabha and get permission for bauxite mining in the Kalahandi and the Raigad district of Odisha, thereby truly giving importance and value to what is called the sanctity of the Gram Sabha. There are, of course, certain challenges to this. PISA comes under the 5th schedule, where the governor has certain extra constitutional and extra judicial powers. This can seem to be a conflict. Second, there is a tribal advisory council which oversees tribal affairs. Now, the Panchayati Raj and the Ministry of Tribal Affairs have an overlapping influence on the implementation of PISA. Now, at the end of the day, there are, of course, issues of lack of political will. All states have not really implemented it in its true form and true letter and spirit. For example, Chhattisgarh has only formulated draft rules as early as 22nd November, as recent as 22nd November 2021 is in the newspapers. And of course, when we look at the powers that we're talking about, such as minor water bodies, minor minerals, there is no legal definition of this. The minor minerals that we talk about are largely mentioned in the Minor Minerals Act in their schedules, but there is no definition of classification as such. And what usually happens is that after enacting this, the union government has also brought several other legislations and included provisions of PISA into these laws, such as land acquisition, forest rights, dwellers acts, and this is where it sort of overlaps and enters into the domain area of these laws that we are talking about. There are certain solutions to this. The solutions are that the scheduled area should have a structure where the Gram Sabha is not overridden or overpowered. Civic societies, NGO groups can run awareness campaigns. The respective state government should have very specific rules, and a model act could also be created by the center, allowing or sort of giving direction to the states, and detailed specific guidelines should be given, and this should be done within a specific time frame. Very generic sort of recommendations to make any law better. What we're basically trying to do is make a system of government better. That's it. Whether it is the center, the states, or local, the primary arguments remain the same. Which then brings me to the final issues of checks and balances over Panchayati Raj and their accountability. See, under state laws, a lot of the wide powers of suspension and dismissal have been vested in state bureaucracy. Now, this means the bureaucracy versus the Panchayati Raj institutions are always going to be a matter of conflict. Second is, when you merge district rural development agencies with Zilla Parishad, then the mandate, the composition, the functions become slightly difficult. And the idea here is that all of this should largely work under the overall control and supervision of Zilla Parishads, because they would have the democratic mandate to do so. Third is there are several issues of mistreatment, of abuse, of harassment by local district officials, wherein Gram Panchayat Sarpanches, all of these guys go to the local offices to sort of, state their mind. And not only this, there is politicization here. Now you have national parties and regional parties and registered parties entering into local election domain. And when that happens, the entourage happens, the money happens, the muscle power happens, the criminalization of politics happens, the politicization of criminals happen, which is also the issue of the conduct of elections, right? And the elections are not conducted with the same pomp and show, with the same enthusiastic zeal as center and state elections do, which is also one of the points in our first issue of conduct of elections. See, within the tier system, in the rural part the 3 tiers, in the urban part the 2 tiers, they're also competing for funds, and of course the lower tiers will be at a disadvantage. The higher tiers will be closer to the district administration, closer to the state government, and therefore the fundamental principle of decentralized development then takes a backseat. And that is why a massive awareness generation program must be taken up to inform the Gram Sabhas about what can be done and how can governance and development be better, right? In terms of sort of way forward, if you look at a larger issue, is that popular projects which are sort of taken by panchayats for utilizing funds which are granted by the Finance Commission are actually road construction, maintenance of supply of drinking water. They should be, even given more emphasis. The Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan, which has been launched to actively sort of engage panchayats and sort of has also been used for, giving employment to reverse migrated people from the country, from the metros. At the same time, leaders of several states have also started holding video conferences with sarpanches with the help of the district administration. The Rashtriya Gram Swaraj Abhiyan, which was launched for a period of 18th March to March 22, but the primary aim of strengthening Panchayati Raj, this has been an extremely successful setup. The emphasis has been on strengthening Panchayati Raj by giving orientation for elected representatives, giving them training, and of course using e-governance and giving them tools of data, of monitoring, of evaluation, making them a participative entity in the process, of course, has been great. And at the same time, you can use certain examples of how they have been effective during COVID-19. For example, in Orissa, they had worked tirelessly to ensure ration had reached. In Chhattisgarh, in the Sukma district, rations were provided. Whether the state government was facilitating it or not, they used their own funds. Community kitchens were being set up all across the country. This was largely done with Panchayati Raj support. Chhattisgarh's Kankar district, the Sivni Gram Panchayat in vegetable production essentially has made the entire district almost self-sufficient, and you don't have to worry about vegetables coming from across the state or other parts of the country. Gram Panchayats are of course now supporting migrants, employment is being generated, very effective tools for MG, Narega and so on and so forth. And in many cities, municipal corporate councils have also taken initiative to sell vegetables on wheels to its citizens, so that they don't have to stop, they don't have to go out to the market, the cart comes to your colony, and therefore sort of limiting social distancing. So a lot has been done as far as LSG is concerned, as far as work in this context is concerned. And I think this is more than enough to write any possible answer any question that could come as far as local self-government is concerned. We've now covered theme 2. Go through the slides, download the handouts, and then we'll start with theme 3 in a day or two. Theme 3 is going to be very small because essentially is comparative constitutions. So we'll cover that up in a day or two. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.